So I'm back from a few months long hiatus. I figured I'd start re-uploading to the channel since there's a lot going on and the race has certainly changed. But more importantly, the fact that election day is only a few months away, I figured I would get back in here. So the first video today is just going to be my general election prediction for the month of September. All of the safe states are already filled out. These are states either candidate will win by around 12 points or more. And these aren't really going to change no matter what happens. One safe state I'm going to add to the traditional lot of blue states is New Mexico. I know there's a lot of people talking about how Trump could possibly improve with Latino voters, but in my opinion, I think that's going to be offset most likely by the white voters that jump ship and go to Joe Biden, especially when it comes to the Southwest down here. And New Mexico was a state that Trump lost by 8 points, and since both candidates were fairly unpopular in the state, Joe Biden does not have as much baggage as Hillary Clinton. He has different baggage, but I think he's going to perform better in the state and that he'll definitely break 50% of the vote and get a margin somewhere around 12 points, which is why, for the time being, I'm going to put New Mexico in the safe column. So we're going to be moving west to east here. We're going to start off with the state of Nevada. Just looking at some polls real quick. That's Utah. Utah is not in play no matter what anyone tells you. Trump won Utah by a safe margin back in 2016. Utah is not going to move, so I don't even want to entertain that idea because I just don't think it's plausible. The polling aggregate for Trump is actually similar to his polling in the other Rust Belt states, and the polls have narrowed quite a bit. Depending on the aggregate we look at here, Biden is up as little as 4.5 or 6 points. But honestly, I think with the coronavirus and all of the other unrest going on, Nevada's not really going to be that contested. I could see it going to Biden probably by a lean margin. Earlier in the race, I entertained it going to Trump, particularly from the Latino factor, and also he was much more popular relative to his popularity, of course. And also we weren't dealing with these kind of society-changing events going on right now. Also, we're going to take out, I just noticed, we're going to take out New Hampshire from the safe column. New Hampshire's not going to be a safe state for Biden, but we'll get to that later. Arizona is a really interesting state now. Arizona was a state that Trump won by 3.5 points in 2016, and the polls there have been getting tighter. Now, some of the aggregates are actually a tiny bit lower than the Nevada ones, which is expected. Arizona is a traditionally Republican state. I believe since 1948, Arizona has only gone blue one time. I could be wrong with that, but I think Arizona has only gone blue once since 1948, and that was in 1996, presidentially speaking, even surviving the Lyndon Johnson landslide of 1964. But anyway, if we look at the polling from Arizona here, Joe Biden's been up very, very, very consistently in the state. It's a state that Trump has never been too popular in. Of course, it's the home state of former Senator John McCain, who was, after his death especially, very well liked in the state of Arizona. But again, a lot of these polling aggregates have Biden up very consistently. Now, if we just go back 4 years, Trump won this state by the narrowest margin, I think, of any Republican since the 1990s. And polls at this point actually had Arizona as either lean Democrat or lean Republican. But either way, this was a very, very close state. And I expect it to probably get down to the wire in 2020. It's tough to put this state in either camp, but I don't want to leave any toss-ups or swings this election. So if I really had to bet my money on it, I would say that Trump would probably carry the state by less than a point. I don't think Arizona is going to flip just yet, and even based on the midterms, I really don't see the state going blue just because it went blue pretty narrowly in 2018. It was only a few points, and I think Trump will have just enough energy down in Arizona. Again, that Latino factor could play a role, honestly, and it's only a few points. It's not like they're jumping ship or anything. It's just that Biden is underperforming to where Hillary Clinton was at this time. Colorado is probably going to be likely Biden. We don't really have to talk too much about Colorado. If we look at the polls out of Colorado, Trump has been going up, but Trump is not even ahead in a single poll. Arizona, Trump was ahead some polls. Trump has never been ahead in the state of Colorado. This is a state Hillary won by around 5 points. I don't think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to the state, and I really don't think there needs to be. Texas is interesting. So if we look at Texas polling-wise, the polls kind of are all over the place. But Trump is more consistently up in Texas. I know in 2018 we had a very close midterm election, and that affected a lot of down ballot races, lieutenant governor, basically everything that wasn't Greg Abbott's seat was pretty close, and that was mostly due to Beto O'Rourke running a pretty well energized campaign, and the fact that Ted Cruz was a very controversial figure. I won't say he's not as popular, because his popularity was fairly average for a state like Texas, so that's why the almost upset, was really surprising. But Trump is ahead in all of the polls in Texas now. Texas is a state I don't see realistically flipping. However, in most cases, I've given the margin of victory to Trump in the state of Texas as likely. I'm going to downgrade that to lean. I don't think Texas is going to be as comfortable for Trump as I thought it would have been earlier in the race, because there are some polls that have Biden up ahead. Now, ultimately, I think Trump is probably going to win the state of Texas by around 4 points, which would put it around in the lean category, maybe 3 on the low end. I don't see this state flipping. The Biden campaign is not really putting a lot of effort into it. I know they release some news articles every now and then saying they're going to try and put some effort into the state, but realistically, I think that'd be effort in vain, because Texas is a very large state, almost 30 million people, and you'd have to spend a whole lot of money to campaign there statewide. And when Texas does inevitably become a real swing state, a real toss-up, it's just going to be whoever has the most money, most likely, because this is a giant state, both geographically and population-wise. Nebraska's second is a state that there's not a whole lot of polls, a district that there's not a whole lot of polls out. I'm going to rank this as tilt Republican, because this was a state that Donald Trump won by 2 points, and that Don Bacon back in 2018 won by 1 point. And considering that was a +9 Democratic environment, I think it's safe to say that this district is going to stay Republican, at least for this election. Minnesota. Minnesota was a state that Trump only lost by 1.5 points, so it was guessed by a lot of people that this state was going to be in play. So Trump has actually been putting resources in Minnesota, unlike the last time he ran for office. The polling averages here are much higher than other Rust Belt states. Sometimes it depends, of course, on the poll. But consistently lately, the past month or so, Joe Biden has been up fairly comfortably. Now, some of these polls, 57 to 41, I think are a bit more ridiculous. I think Morning Consult is much more accurate. I think at the end of the day, Minnesota could be close. I really do think Minnesota will be close. But it's important to note that the gains that Democrats made in the suburbs, I think, offset the rural gains that Republicans have been making in the outer counties here. If we look back at the 2016 election at Minnesota, and we look at the change from 2012, the Twin City metro area was the only part of the state that trended more Democratic. And even though these rural areas trended heavily Republican, at the end of the day, Trump only got 44.9% of the vote. If Hillary Clinton had been a popular Democrat, Trump would have gotten a fairly typical Republican margin for the state. Hillary Clinton probably would have gotten in the low 50s like Obama in 2012. So I think ultimately Minnesota is going to be lean Joe Biden as of right now. Again, I really do think Trump's response to COVID has really hurt him, among a bunch of other factors. And let's face it, 2016, in a lot of people's eyes, was just a gauge on whether the country hated Hillary or Donald Trump more, and it seems that the country disliked Hillary more than they disliked Trump, but again, that was before Trump was in office for 4 years. Again, I like to keep these projections as honest and as objective as possible, and from the way I've seen it from a typical American standpoint, or an independent standpoint, I think it's going to be a lot tougher for Trump given the factors that we have. 20% real unemployment, a pandemic that has killed over 200,000 people. It is quite startling and is expected to kill up to 300,000 people before Christmas. Regardless of what your opinions are on the handling of it, when an average American sees that, we're not better off than we were 4 years ago. So it's very hard for Trump to make up that ground. So Iowa is the next state we're going to be looking at. The state of Iowa, Trump is up in the polling aggregate, and it is a state he won very comfortably back in 2016. He actually won the state by about 10 points, which is a larger margin than he won Texas by, which really goes to show you the massive swing the state of Iowa did for President Trump. So ultimately, I don't think Iowa is going to be that contested. Trump is up narrowly in the polls, but he's also narrowly up in Texas. I think Trump is going to still perform very, very well in the state of Iowa. I think he'll win it by a likely margin, probably around 6 points, so smaller than he won in 2016. But again, if he's not up in the polls, and a lot of the polls in the Rust Belt in this area tend to favor Democrats, Joe Biden really shouldn't put a lot of resources in the state. And I don't believe that he is. Joe Biden really needs to focus on these Rust Belt states. And that brings us to the state of Wisconsin. So Wisconsin in 2016 was one of those states that Donald Trump won by 0.7. The other one, of course, was Pennsylvania. Again, looking at the trends from 2012, basically the entire state minus the Milwaukee area trended Republican. And if we look, of course, at the margins, a lot of these counties, particularly here in the Southwest, which are swing counties, went to Trump by lean margins, pretty comfortable margins, like Grant County down here, and these other counties outside of Madison, which is a very progressive county in Wisconsin. Ultimately, the state as a whole trended more Republican, but that does not mean it's going to stay Republican, of course. If we look at the polling aggregates, Biden is up here higher than he is, of course, in Arizona, and actually in some cases higher than he is in Minnesota, although the polling average has actually gone up for him. It was usually around 5 points to his advantage. Now it's up 6, and Trump hasn't led in a poll in a state since mid-August. And as we get closer to the election, polls typically narrow, but in this case, they're going to Biden pretty handedly. A word of caution, though, it is still August. We still have over 2 months. Less than 2 months, I mean August. It's September now. What am I saying? But we still have time. However, as of right now, the state does not look good for Donald Trump, and honestly looks like it's going to go to Joe Biden by a tilt margin. Now, the reason I say tilt margin and not lean margin is because there's going to be a lot of attention paid to this state. I really do think that the polls are going to narrow, but as it's looking right now, it doesn't seem like Trump is going to make up that deficit with the current strategy he's employing in these states, and I will get to that. There could be a change of strategy, but I plan to make a video on Trump's 2020 election strategy and why I think it actually is hurting him in a lot of these states where he should be doing a lot better. Next, we're going to be looking at Michigan. Of course, Michigan was one of the closest states. New Hampshire was the closest, but was the second closest state in the entire country. It went to Trump by 0.3% or 11,000 votes. And it was super, super narrow. If we look at the trends, every single county, -4, of course, trended more Republican. Most notably was Wayne County, home of Detroit, which actually trended pretty heavily Republican for a very urban county the way it is, and having a large African-American population, which tends to favor Democrats very much so. But it looks like they did not come out for Hillary Clinton the way they came out for Obama. Again, back in 2012, Michigan went to Obama by around 10 points. And now we've gotten to a point where Trump has effectively won the state. But of course, if we look at the polling from the state of Michigan, it's actually a bit better than the state of Wisconsin in some cases. Depending on the aggregate you look at, 270 to win. I don't really like their methodology because sometimes they put a lot of outliers. I just like how Wikipedia has all of these polls here, so it makes my job a lot easier when analyzing these races. But Joe Biden is up very consistently and has been the most consistently up in this state. I know that Trafalgar Group has put Trump up by 1. and they've been fairly accurate in the Rust Belt when it comes to predicting races. However, I still think that Michigan is going to be a very hotly contested state despite all this. But Trump is putting less resources in the state of Michigan than he is for Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. For now, I see Michigan going lean Joe Biden, probably around 3 or 4 points. I still think all these states are going to be relatively close. I don't think we're going to see any blowouts in any of the swing states or anything unexpected. So just to tell you the state of the race now, we have Donald Trump at 181 electoral votes, Joe Biden at 239. And the next state we're looking at is Ohio. So in 2016, Ohio went to Donald Trump by around 8 points. In terms of trends, nearly the entire state, minus the Southwest and the Columbus suburbs, trended Republican. So just like a common theme in the Rust Belt, all of these states went heavily trend-wise toward Donald Trump. If we look at the counties that flipped, most notably these counties in northeast Ohio went heavily to Donald Trump, particularly Stark County and these other counties here in the northeast. A lot of them trending red, including Cleveland, which trended a lot more red. Trump improved on Romney's margins. Hillary did not. And Hillary did very poorly for any Democrat in the state of Ohio in a national race. Even Bush 04, Ohio was not nearly this much of a blowout. Of course, if we look at polls for Ohio, Trump is up fairly... well, it's actually kind of all over the place here. But Trump is up in a good amount of these polls. I don't think Trafalgar has a poll for the state of Ohio yet. But effectively, it's a state that could be a bit closer. As of right now, I think I would call the state for Trump, but in the lean column. So unlike Ohio, Iowa, I think Ohio is going to be closer. I think it could be a 4 or 5 point margin. But again, polls oversample Democrats in these states. So I'm already giving Trump the edge by giving him the state. I think it's fair to assume that Trump's going to win Ohio. I really don't see Biden picking it up, and I don't see him putting a whole lot of effort in the state. So we'll head north to south now with Maine's 2nd District and Maine at large. So if we go back to 2016, Maine got very close for a New England state, other than New Hampshire. Usually all of the other states in New England are not contested. New Hampshire is the oddball in that sense. If we look at the trends, all of Maine, unsurprisingly, trended very, very Republican. And the reason I say unsurprisingly is because Obama won the state by 16 points back in 2012, and in 2008 it might have been 17. So this was a safe Democratic state up until 2016. If we look at polls out of the state of Maine, we're going to see that Biden has a pretty comfortable advantage. In fact, a very comfortable advantage in terms of the at-large. I think it's safe to say that Maine's 2nd is probably going to go to Donald Trump. So I'm going to put Maine's 2nd for Donald Trump probably in the lean column. Donald Trump won it by 10 in 2016, but it seems that he's underperforming in the state, especially dragging down Susan Collins as well in the Senate race, which I'll make a video on that soon, analyzing all of these Senate races and analyzing some House races as well that could be pivotal this time around. But again, there wasn't a whole lot of polling out of the state of Maine in 2016, but in 2020 we have a good amount of polling. Maine's 1st district I've already put as safe. I don't see that changing. And Maine at large, I think ultimately will probably go to Biden by a likely margin, albeit a lower likely margin. I think that resources are actually going to be spent in the state. I would not see it surprising in the least bit that Biden wins the state by around 8 points this time around, especially since it has trended. It's trended more Republican overall, but I think this election is going to buck the trend considering Trump's unfavorables are very, very high in the state of Maine, very high. And I might do a video just looking at those. But the recent unfavorables are in the double digits, and that really hurts Trump. And I don't see him having a chance at large. However, I still think he'll secure Maine's 2nd because polls are still somewhat competitive there. And, of course, he won it by such a big margin back in 2016. New Hampshire is another state that people are watching pretty closely. This was the closest state in the 2016 election by margin and by raw vote total. Hillary Clinton won by under 3,000 votes. Of course, if we look at the trends, the entire state trended red, but that's no surprise. Gary Johnson, of course, was a big factor in this election. So Gary Johnson took 4% of the vote. That may or may not have impacted the result of the race. However, what is interesting is that Chris Sununu, who actually is a very pro-Trump governor from New Hampshire, won fairly comfortably. He won by 3 points compared to these very razor-thin margins, although that could be because the Sununu family name carries a lot of weight in New Hampshire. But ultimately, New Hampshire went blue in 2016 at the end of the day. If we look at the polling out of the state of New Hampshire, Biden is up very comfortably. There we go. There were some polls where Trump actually made it close again, but the overall aggregates are pretty poorly for Trump, and Trump's unfavorables are very high in this state, very high, like Maine, so all of New England. So I think it's safe to put the state of New Hampshire in the lean column for Biden. I still expect it to be relatively close, probably around a 5-point margin or so, 4 or 5 points, similar to Michigan, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to go to Joe Biden. Pennsylvania is another Rust Belt state that is going to be very hotly contested this time around. If we go back to first we'll look back at 2016. PA went to Donald Trump by 0.7% after going to Obama by around 5 points in 2012 and roughly 10 points in 2008. Trend-wise, of course, the only places that really trended blue were Cumberland County, a few counties here and there, but mostly I want to focus on the Philadelphia suburbs. Philadelphia itself actually trended more Republican, as well as Bucks County, which is a very, very close county when it comes to margins. Even in 2008, it was similar to the state in terms of the way it voted, but especially if you look at 2012, it was very, very close. Chester County is another county that tends to be close. I almost like to think of it as the anti-bellwether because in 2012 it voted for Romney when the state as a whole voted for Barack Obama, as well as back from 2004 to 1992 back, Chester County has been a red county while the rest of the county has voted blue. So in a way, it's almost an anti-bellwether, voting for the loser of the person who carries the state at large. But again, the biggest shifts in 2016 in terms of going from Obama to Trump were Erie County, Northampton County, and Luzerne County. These were the three counties in 2012 that voted for Obama that flipped to Trump. Other counties that got really close, Lackawanna County, Monroe County, stuff like that. But let's look at the polling average because that was 2016 and this is 2020. And circumstances have certainly changed. If we look at polling, Biden has been going down. Trump has been going up a tiny, tiny bit. But overall, it's going to be a very close state. Very close state. Trafalgar, I don't believe, has done a poll in Pennsylvania yet, at least recently. But at the end of the day, it's been getting much more narrow. This is the closest Rust Belt state by aggregate. And I personally believe it will be the closest state in the entire Rust Belt. I think Michigan and Wisconsin will, at this state in the race, will probably go to Biden a little bit more. But right now, it's looking like this is going to be down to the wire. Of course, Trump's unfavorables in Pennsylvania are decently high. And Biden has been consistently up in the polls since July. And again, polls aren't indicative of a whole lot, but they are indicative of something. At this point, I think Pennsylvania is going to go tilt Biden. And the reason why I'm giving a lot of these close states to Biden is, like I've talked about, I personally believe that Trump's 2020 strategy is a detriment to him. And also the current circumstances really, really hurt him. However, I think the overall trends of these Rust Belt states are Republican, and that's why I think the margin is still going to be close, because Trump has a whole lot of enthusiasm that Joe Biden doesn't have. Joe Biden is essentially the anti-Trump vote, whereas Trump supporters are coming out in favor of Donald Trump. So that is going to play a big role in the margins here. Virginia, we're not going to talk a lot about. Virginia is going to go to Joe Biden, and with that, he's going to win the presidency. I'm going to put it in the high likely category. I think it's going to be on the high end, 9-10 points. You could even kind of flip it in safe, but I'm just going to do likely for now because, 2017 for an off year was actually somewhat, wasn't as much of a blowout for Ralph Northam as it could have been. Of course, if we looked at 2018, it went overwhelmingly for Tim Kaine and the Democrats, particularly because Corey Stewart was a very bad candidate, but also because the state has just trended so blue. I often debate whether this is really safe or not. I really don't think Virginia is going to flip. Let's just look at some of the polls in Virginia. Yeah, Virginia is a complete blowout for Joe Biden. This is a state that's not going to be contested. I think Trump's going to do a little bit better than the polls say, but it's going to be a high likely margin for sure. Some people even have it as safe. I wouldn't do it as safe yet, but definitely in 2024, Virginia is going to be safe blue and not really competitive anymore. I really don't see Virginia swinging back to the Republicans anytime soon. Democrats gain in the suburbs I see as a very long-term thing, and if Virginia were to somehow swing back, it would take a very long time for Virginians to get there. North Carolina is a state that's been super close all election. I just want to look at the polls there before we dive into the results from 2016. The polls have been all over the place for North Carolina. Trafalgar has Trump up a good amount, and the reason why I keep bringing up Trafalgar is because in 2016 in the Rust Belt states, I think they were off by a point, but they predicted that Trump was going to win I believe Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but it might have been Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I don't know what I said there. But the reason I hold that poll in such high regard is because it was it's a very accurate poll when it comes to Rust Belt states, and it also accurately predicted the midterms in the Rust Belt as well, going pretty heavily for the Democrats. So polling in here is very, very close. But Trafalgar has also been good at predicting races in the Carolinas. They predicted the South Carolina gubernatorial Republican primary by 0.1%. They were off by 0.1%, which was absolutely incredible. North Carolina is a state that if Biden is not doing as well in the aggregate, he's not going to win the state. Trump will win the state of North Carolina, I predict. By a tilt margin. I think it'll be around a 2-point margin of victory. It's going to be less than it was last time. Biden is not up in the polls enough. He just simply isn't. There have been Democrats, Kay Hagan in 2014, for example. She was up by 5 in the aggregate, ended up losing by around 2 points. Cal Cunningham, on the other hand, is up by a good amount. So in terms of the Senate race, that is a race that could actually flip in favor of the Democrats. Tom Tillis recently had a scandal with one of his staffers on the issue of health care. Very bad on his image, but also Cal Cunningham has been consistently up in the polls. Just looking back at 2016 real quick, North Carolina as a whole trended more red than it was in 2012. Despite Donald Trump not getting a majority of the vote in the state, he did win by the largest margin of any Republican since 2004. Romney only won the state by 2. Trump almost won the state by 3.6. So that's slightly larger than the margin in Arizona. This state's going to probably be closer just because Biden is not as unpopular as Hillary Clinton, but it would not surprise me if we saw a 50-48 scenario in the state. However, it could be more Republican than I'm letting on, because if you look at the total vote margin from 2008 to 2016, Republicans have gained roughly 100,000 votes every election, whereas Democrats have been gaining at a snail's pace in comparison. So hence why their margins decrease every single time. But I think North Carolina is going to be a state that Trump wins. Georgia, another state we're not going to talk too much about. I think it's going to be lean Donald Trump. We could look at some polls out of Georgia, which are favoring Trump now. They were actually favoring Biden earlier in the race. Biden has been getting somewhat close, but ultimately Trump has been up in the polling, and I think he's probably going to win this state by around 3 points. I think it's going to be much closer than it was last time. It was 5 points last time if we go down to Georgia. It was a 5.1 margin of victory. But again, the trends going blue for the Atlanta metro area do bode poorly for Republicans going into the future. However, I think this election, Georgia is going to be a state that's not too hotly contested. And again, it could be more contested than it is, but the Biden campaign is not really spending a lot of time in this state, which I don't think they really need to. And that is going to definitely give it to Trump by a small margin, but give it to him nonetheless. So now we're down to the last state on our prediction map, Florida. Just for reference, if we give Florida to Biden, he gets 307 electoral votes. If we give Florida to Trump, he gets 260 electoral votes. But we're going to look at the polling from Florida and really analyze which way this state is going to go in 2020. So Trump has actually fallen off in the aggregate, but these polls are very close for Biden. Very close. This is a state that Biden was up in the aggregate as high as 8 points at, I think it was in April, so a few months ago in the race. But this is a state that has gotten very, very tight, very tight. And Joe Biden is up consistently in the polls. However, the margins are very small, and there are some polls where Trump is actually up. And of course, Trafalgar has Trump up by 3. Now, again, Trafalgar is not as accurate in the Sun Belt, which would include Florida, so I'm not going to really take that into account. However, there's one thing I will still take into account, and that is the 2018 midterms, because Florida, for some reason, was immune to that blue wave. Florida actually got redder in the midterms. And based on that fact alone and the fact that the polls, Joe Biden is not up in the polls to convince me that he's going to win the state. At the end of the day, I do think Trump is going to narrowly win the state of Florida, which puts us at a very close race scenario, which could be a nightmare scenario, quite frankly, with mail-in ballots, depending on how quick we get the results. But we're looking at right now Joe Biden winning the election by 278 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 260. Arizona could be one of those, could be the fluke state if we give Arizona to Biden, just say by tilt, he wins by 289. But that still is a relatively close margin nonetheless. I think the reason why the margin isn't larger is mainly due to the fact that Florida I gave to Trump, and Florida is a very big state. However, that's the way I see Florida honestly going, and I've been consistent on that. I really don't think Florida is going to go blue in the general, just objectively looking at the race. Florida has trended more red on the state level since 2008. And I think the boomer vote from the Northeast, particularly from New York and Illinois, going down there offsets the gains that Democrats would make with the demographic change and the rising Latino population in the state. Anyway, that is my September prediction for the general election. This is the first prediction, I think, where I've had Joe Biden up, but this is genuinely where I see the race being right now. Donald Trump really, really has to work on hammering the Rust Belt in order to win this election. And honestly, a few visits to the Sun Belt wouldn't hurt him, but since the Electoral College is how we do things in this country, the Rust Belt is where he needs to put his focus on. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be making more election predictions like this, as well as Senate and House predictions as the general gets closer, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, that's all. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.